I think I can speak for all of the presenters that the hardest thing of getting organized for a presentation is what to leave out. Because everybody has more than ample things to say. So when Perry actually gave me, and I'm reaching my pockets because I'm looking for my notes while I fake it here. Perry gave me an actual topic, as he said, and said, come and talk to us and tell us what it is that you know about this subject. So I sat down and put the notes together, and they're pretty lengthy, so I'm going to summarize. I'll leave them up here on the podium for those of you who would like to come up and read them more thoroughly later. As I was working on deciding what it was to talk about, my wife, who Diane Hobby knows from days with U.S. Senator Hank Brown, got to be the foil for many of the things that I was contemplating to either talk about or to leave out. So that went on Saturday. Sunday morning at breakfast, I continued, and she finally said, "Sweetie, you know the movie A Beautiful Mind?" I said, "Yeah." She said, it wasn't about you. So please, don't tell me anymore. I don't really care about this. So are we up? Yeah? Nope, close. Dr. Pritchett did such a wonderful job. I almost hate to come up here and talk about economics and water. I've always thought that people who don't have any faith in fortune tellers or Ouija boards, for some reason, persist in listening to economists. And I've decided the way to really master economics is to get elected to Congress. Because there are 535 experts in economics by courtesy of the voters. They may or may not know anything about supply and demand or markets, but by golly willikers, they can sure make policy. And so we have that. So we got an answer. So we're really going to talk a lot about water conservation, because it is so much of the things that are going on at this particular time, what we're going to be facing in the future. And among those things is, why are we concerned about conserving water? Well, first of all, it's a scarce resource, as we all know. How many times have we heard people talk today, here and tomorrow, that water is a scarce resource? But it's also because each use of water is a trade-off. And we have to make decisions. We have to make choices. We have to evaluate what it is that we're going to be using the water for, and more particularly, what it is we're not going to be using the water for. And that becomes the essence of why we have the debate on water conservation. Renewability is really the key to water supply. And if you think about looking at the definition that the USGS has used for many years about what is renewability, the formula is pretty simple. It's precipitation plus the imports of water, minus the exports of water, minus the natural evaporation. Colorado's problem. We're not importing any water. So the left side of our equation is all reliant 100% on precipitation. Without precipitation, we don't have any water supply, we don't have any renewability, we don't have any sustainability. So it becomes increasingly important that we start talking about what it is we're going to be doing if we get climate change. One can debate whether that's going to happen, whether it's already happening, where we may be in the epic geological time. But nonetheless, we're going to have continuing supply challenges. There's nothing that we can do about that, partially because of our precipitation issues, which are always erratic. And as somebody talked about this morning, I think maybe Bob Sakata, what happens is the population increases along the way. So let's talk about scarcity a little bit. Scarcity is really a concept of economics, that if there's no use for the substance, the commodity, or the natural resource, there is no scarcity. It doesn't matter if it's finite, it has to have some kind of an economic use. We just heard the presentation that talked about produced water that has come from the coal bed methane gas development. For a long time, that was considered to be nuisance water. The developer, the oil and gas operation, would simply try to find a way to dispose of it. It was finite, but it wasn't scarce because there was no economic use for it. As it has become more potentially possible to use that for economic purposes, scarcity starts to present itself. So we have a problem of scarcity that we have to deal with. So finite does not necessarily mean scarce. Scarce, however, always means that it's finite. Scarcity and shortage are not the same thing. There's a significant difference, and it's a really important difference because we're going to talk about doctrine of prior appropriation here in just a minute. Scarcity always exists. As long as there's an economic need and an economic demand for the substance, scarcity is there. Shortages are temporary interruptions in the supply of some sort of a commodity. And shortages of supply ultimately are self-correcting through market mechanisms. Scarcity forces us to make choices between uses. And there's absolutely no way to escape that. We have to deal with that, and the way we deal with that is with rationing. Now, I know rationing can be a pejorative term. It can be a term that brings on a lot of emotion. It's reminiscent of the days of coupons, things like that, issued by the government. But rationing is a function of the market. That's what markets are intended to do. Markets are intended to sort out the uses, to ration those uses and the goods that go with them in some way. Markets fail. All markets fail. Governments also ration, as we have seen in many circumstances. So we have a combination of market rationing and we have, along with governmental rationing. I value my friend Gary Barber, who keeps bringing this problem to my attention. It's the tragedy of commons. Most of you have heard of the tragedy of commons, probably read the articles and things. But the important part about the tragedy of commons is that if you don't manage the resource, it will become depleted, it will become deteriorated, and it will lose all of its value for current and for future uses. So the tragedy of the commons can be avoided, it can be mitigated, because there are 535 experts in economics by courtesy of the voters. You may or may not know anything about supply and demand or markets, but by golly willikers, they can sure make policy. And so we have that. So we got an answer. It may also be the fact that two household incomes went to one. Or somebody got laid off. Somebody's income dropped because they went from full-time to part-time work. They may have had to take in other family members. Some of you may unfortunately be in the situation where your kids graduate from college, you thought you were done, they're now living in your basement because they can't find a job. This was not your game plan. So income trumps price to a very large extent. And we need to keep that in mind and understand. If you're the water manager and you just found out that your major employer is going to be cutting back employment by 30% or 40%, it's going to have a significant impact on the way that you manage your system and how you set your pricing. So we need to keep that in mind. Classic example here between normal and inferior goods is there's tenderloin steak versus low price hamburger enhanced by various fillers. As income goes up, people are more likely to buy tenderloin steak. Incomes go down, they move from tenderloin steak to hamburger. But that doesn't work if there are no substitutes. So the example I would give you is that of a diabetic that is insulin dependent. There are no substitutes for insulin if you're an insulin dependent diabetic. No matter how high the price gets for insulin, you're going to have to make that price work for you if that means you have to give up other kinds of important things that are totally unrelated, because the income and the budget become the things that are important. We also have a tendency to overlook the fact that consumers are a heck of a lot smarter than we give them credit for. They really are quite clever in finding ways to meet their needs. So let's think about a residential property, and we've just increased the water rates on the consumption on the premise that the consumption would decrease. Well, suppose that house also houses an in-home child care center. And the owners of the child care center, the parents, think that having grass to play on is preferable to having gravel to play on. The obvious thing for the person to do that's running the center is to turn around and increase the prices to the parents to say, water rates have gone up, we got to have grass, sorry about that, I've got to pass it on. So consumers figure out ways to get around some of these mechanisms, and it's perilous to come back and say, this is for sure going to happen, because it's much more complex than it may appear. You can't read this one either. Two people in the store, one is looking at this, when did water start costing as much as wine? Thursday. If you haven't paid attention, it's coming up fairly quickly. So the consumers are going to make decisions, but they're going to make decisions not just on price. They're also going to make decisions on the basis of their taste, their preference, and their values. So we go back and we talk about our situation with meat. For a Hindu, beef is an unacceptable product. So no matter how low the price drops for hamburger, it is foolish to think that the Hindu is going to be driven by price to move over and start eating the McDonald's. It's just not going to happen. And so when we start working on conservation concepts in the municipal system, we have to pay attention to the taste, the preference, and the values of the consumer, because they are important as well. For many people who grew up in the 1960s and the 1970s, even the early 1980s, bluegrass lawns were considered a high value for residential property. That may not be the case anymore, because tastes and values and preferences are shifting. So the premium isn't as much as it might have been. So when we start looking at pricing and we start talking about whether or not the consumer is going to make adjustments and they're going to reduce their consumption, which is going to conserve water, we need to take into consider not only the price, but also the income, also the taste, values, and preferences, and how important that item is within the consumer's budget. One of the manifestations of the subsidized or the kind of water pricing that we've used historically in water is that it has been favorable to low incomes or people with large needs and modest incomes, because the subsidies are built in from the high users. We take away the high user and we go to a much more rigid pricing structure, it is going to take away those cross subsidies from some of those folks who are facing income challenges along the way. And you can be sure that elected officials will hear about that. So can prices drive conservation? Sure, to a limited extent. And you got to be aware of what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it, and pay attention, because it's not a magic wand. You can't wave it over the system and expect to get the kinds of changes that you might want. The elasticity, substitutability is something that we cannot escape. It is a factor, it has to be taken into consideration. So the answer is sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So with that, I think we got some time for some questions. Also, anything else that you want to talk about? I have a couple of observations from all this. One is that, and I'll try to do this so Commissioner Romet doesn't fall out of his chair and faint. We are undervaluing water storage. None of these strategies work without storage. You can't do long-term, comprehensive water conservation without storage, because the more dependent the users become on a rigid supply and the higher uses of the water in their lives become, you've lost the flexibility of the system. So you've got to have redundant systems, and you've got to have storage in order to assure that you can deliver those water supplies for those folks. To my knowledge, nobody is advocating for coin-operated fire hydrants. So if you can't have ongoing fire protection at the same time that you're dealing with the cooking needs, the laundry needs, the bathing needs, everything else that's in that house, you're going to have some disruptions, and those disruptions are going to turn out to be very, very problematic. The other characteristic of water, and this is not going to come as a surprise to anybody in this room, is it's not only an economic good, it's a political good. And political goods get put into legislative processes, whether it's the city council, the state legislature, or the Congress. And I can assure you that somebody out there will react negatively to having their water constricted by any means. So you can expect that they will go find their elected officials. Colorado's problem, we're not importing any water. So the left side of our equation is all reliant 100% on precipitation. Without precipitation, we don't have any water supply, we don't have any renewability, we don't have any sustainability. So it becomes increasingly important that we start talking about what it is we're going to be doing if we get climate change. One can debate whether that's going to happen, whether it's already happening, where we may be in the epic geological time. But nonetheless, we're going to have continuing supply challenges. There's nothing that we can do about that, partially because of our precipitation issues, which are always erratic. And as somebody talked about this morning, I think it may have been Bob Sakata, what happens as the population increases along the way. So let's talk about scarcity a little bit. Scarcity is ultimately are self-correcting through market mechanisms. Scarcity forces us to make choices between uses. And there's absolutely no way to escape that. We have to deal with that. And the way we deal with that, lose all of its value for current and for future uses. So the tragedy of commons can be avoided, it can be mitigated by the application of property rights. And you've got to have property rights, you have to vest property rights into the product, into the commodity, into the natural resource if you're going to manage it properly. You can also have public ownership and governmental regulation as well. So let's move a little bit to the doctrine of prior appropriation, which is near and dear to everybody's heart because it is something that we live with on a daily basis. Anybody that has anything to do with water knows it quite intimately. It's usually thought of as a legal doctrine, and it is. We seem to have developed a sense that the doctrine of prior appropriation is actually only a legal document. It's more than that. It's also part of the social fabric of the state of Colorado. It's a bit of our cultural paradigm. It's how we hold our state together because nothing is more important than the fabric of our water system and how it is used and how it adds to the productive capacity of the state of Colorado. So the doctrine addresses both of our two economic problems I just mentioned, scarcity and shortage. Scarcity because it relies on market forces largely to ration the resource of water. Shortages because doctrine's emphasis and also the statutory and regulatory law that has come along to support the doctrine deals with first in time, first in right. So when there's a shortage, the doctrine deals with shortage as well. So in a way, it may not have been intended to deal with these kinds of economic problems, but it has in fact provided us with the stability, the security, the predictability, and the management of risk that has allowed for more than a century to provide Colorado with an ongoing, stable economic community that utilizes the resource of water. If water were not a scarce resource, we wouldn't have to worry about rationing. We didn't have to worry about rationing it. We wouldn't need the doctrine of prior appropriation. But that's the way it is. So the doctrine also deals with the tragedy of the commons. It gives us a fabric, it gives us a mechanism to avoid those problems because it starts with, in the Constitution, the statement that the waters of Colorado are owned by the people. And from that, the water rights concept, which is, we all know at this point, is a usufructuary right. Now, it's not an ownership of the water itself, it's a property protected right of the use of that water for the application of the water to beneficial uses. And that right, that usufructuary right, is what can be transferred from one owner to another, from one beneficial use to another beneficial use. So we're going to move here. You probably can't read this. The two people are saying there saying, looking at a very complex formula on the blackboard, and one says the other. So in other words, statistics proves that statisticians are not always right. This is also true of economics and economic formulas. The second reason that we really are concerned about this from the standpoint of economics is opportunity cost. I said earlier that trade-offs are one of the functions of what we're doing with water. Every use of water carries with it an opportunity cost for what it isn't being used for. And we tend to oversimplify opportunity cost. We use lots of rules of thumb. We tend to look at one or two things, but we don't really dig into some of the more complex or subtle issues that surround opportunity costs, which I'm going to come back to in just a second. Opportunity cost is simply the analysis that we make in order to identify and evaluate what the value of the next best option would be compared to the use that we have. So the options before you have to be, first of all, mutually exclusive, but not all uses have equal value. And this becomes particularly important when we start talking about transferring water from agriculture to municipal uses. Because now we're dealing not only with the specific prices or other kinds of costs that are involved, we're also talking about the future. And one of the things about drying up the agricultural land is the land is still there. It doesn't necessarily get used for something else, as we've seen in Crowley County and some of the other examples over the years. So it isn't always a number. Sometimes it's a qualitative value that needs to get assigned to, and we need to contemplate that. Everybody has biases and prejudices, and I have to tell you one of mine is I really don't like buying dry. The reason I don't like buying dry is because it takes the potential for future uses away from the agricultural system and the use of those waters that would come along. So that limits our ability to have options down the road. So opportunity cost is what underlies the whole concept of cost-benefit analysis that all of our engineers use every time that they are assigned to come up with a proposal or a set of solutions or anything it is that we need to do. Of course, we want to move the water, the resource, to its highest and best use, but it becomes important on what it is we don't include in those discussions. Earlier, Dr. Pritchett talked about the labor side of the agricultural industries and how many jobs are created. Also, the amount of business that gets created. So if you're in a situation where you dry up several farms in any kind of geographic region, the ripple effects of that will also hit the schools. It will also hit the churches. It hits the other merchants in town. For the ranchers, for the farmers, if they can't take their equipment to town for maintenance because there's not enough business there to keep that service provider going, they may have to go a long way to get that equipment maintained, which takes time. Transportation costs become involved, and there's a continuing down cycle of those ripple effects. So it becomes very important. There's no free lunch. You've heard that for many times. The reason for it is because of opportunity cost. You have to give up something in order to have what it is that you've got. So let's talk a little bit more about why we're dealing with this conservation. The question obviously is it water or is it the uses of water? And it's occurred to me as I was doing my research that I was using the term water pretty generically. I was using it very expansively. When I actually got into looking and the focal point of what I was doing in the research is, can you use prices? And this was in the context of municipal water supply systems. Can you use price as a mechanism to force conservation? Because the higher the price, obviously, the less consumption it is that you would have. And the more I thought about that, and I started off with that premise, like many of you, I suspect, in the room that have dealt with this, also with your systems, we start off with an understanding that the system of providing water in municipal communities is one that it's much more complex than we think. the water that is provided to the residential consumer usually comes in a pressurized water system. And it comes through a meter, comes into the house, but it's designed to allow the consumer to have simultaneous uses of the water. You can cook, you can bathe, you can irrigate, you can do a number of things all simultaneously. So the consumer doesn't really buy water for a specific application or purpose. Buys the bulk water and then quite informally allocates it out among the uses for which they need to have it applied. Well, that makes pricing a little bit difficult because in economics we have a concept that we call elasticity. And it's a fancy word for, skip up here, substitutability. It simply means that when prices go up, you look around to see what else there is that can satisfy your need. And to the extent that there's more than one commodity that satisfies that, and prices are equal, you will move to the other source. But when you're taking the water through the water meter, all those uses have different kinds of importance to the consumer. Lawn irrigation, outdoor uses of water tend to be much more readily given up than indoor uses of water. And what happens when we continue to focus on that is the consumer makes those kinds of decisions, and the less important things they give up, the more reliant they become upon the more important uses. And those are harder to give up. So for the water manager and the water board, they may see, because of a rate increase, an immediate reduction in water consumption as people adjust, but they're giving up the less important things. What that suggests is that the benefits or the reductions that you get early on are going to be very hard to replicate if you go back and try the water rate increase again and again after that. So the second thing that becomes really important to that for the water manager is when we get more and more people relying upon the highly important things for which they use water, then the system has to be even more reliable than it was. Because when people are relying upon the water for their important needs, you can't have breaks in the water system. You got to have the water there, because otherwise your successor in your job will find a way to go back and work with the town council or whoever it is in order to get that kind of information. So water uses are what we in economics call normal goods, which means that as your income increases, you're going to buy and purchase more of those normal goods. The difference between a normal good and an inferior good is really an issue of income. So we spend a lot of time worrying about price, and we worry about rates, but we don't spend much time in our rate studies talking about the income of the consumer. We just have been going through a very long and extensive recession in this country. And it happened about the same time that we got our drought. So in many circumstances, the water system, when they increased the rates, took that reduction in consumption as an indication that yes, price will in fact drive down consumption. It may also be the fact that two household incomes went to one, or or somebody got laid off. Somebody's income dropped because they went from full-time to part-time work. They may have had to take in other family members. Some of you may unfortunately be in the situation where your kids graduate from college, you thought you were done, they're now living in your basement because they can't find a job. This was Airline State to Hamburg. But that doesn't work if there are no substitutes. So the example I would give you is that of a diabetic that is insulin dependent. There are no substitutes for insulin if you're an insulin dependent diabetic. No matter how adjustments, and they're going to reduce their consumption, which is going to conserve water, we need to take into consider not only the price, but also the income. The other characteristic of water, and this is not going to come to a surprise to anybody in this room, is it's not only an economic good, it's a political good. And political goods get put into legislative processes, whether it's the city council, the state legislature, or the Congress. And I can assure you that somebody out there will react negatively to having their water constricted by any means. So you can expect that they will go find their elected officials to come back and deal with them. So I'd really like to hear from some of you questions, anything it is that you want to talk about. One of the reasons you should master some of these concepts about economics is it's a wonderful way to blame your predecessor for any of the things that aren't working out well under your watch. And if you structure things properly, you can push all the days of reckoning down the road to your successor. Which is a good reason for doing a lot of things. So, do we have any areas that you want to talk about? We can also go back and talk about any things that Dr. Pritchett mentioned, because surprisingly in economics, we generally agree on the basic principles and on some of the things. I thought, his points about the value of agriculture, and Perry's going to talk more about the symposium that he's working on that'll be this fall, that I think we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we're going to look on a river basin-wide perspective about how it is that the people and the communities in the river basins make their living down the road. And water is going to be essential to how those communities, how those industries, how those people make their living. And it's going to have to be done on a regional-wide basis. So I'm very encouraged by the work that Perry and Colorado State University and some of the other folks are doing about trying to develop concepts to evaluate the value of agriculture, because we will also be doing the same thing for other industries that are also important for the economy. We can't look back into the 1940s and the 1950s and the kinds of ways that we made livings are going to be for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, because the world is changing, but water will still be an essential commodity and an essential product for that. So with that, this is great. I love being the speaker after lunch. Everybody is still digesting. Anybody but Gary Barber.
Dick, I was going to ask you to talk about the Colorado River Compact, the recent Bureau study, and the relative economies of the 7 basin states, and whether someone from downstream will start to make an economic argument about us not using our full entitlement.
Yes, I think it's inevitable. When you look back at the history of a lot of the interstate compacts, they were clearly influenced by the economic strength of the various states and their political strengths as they allocated out. And There's a lot more members of Congress from California than there are from Wyoming or from Colorado. And that's just a political fact of life. There are some interesting lawsuits that are going on now. They're going to have some real serious implications for how all these things are going to get interpreted. We know that Texas is involved in litigation with New Mexico and also with Oklahoma. We know that Georgia and Tennessee are involved in a squabble over the boundary that was established, 200 years ago, 250 years ago, which happens to reflect the Tennessee River. And Georgia just made a move to say that the survey was wrong, and they've moved their state line into the middle of the Tennessee River so that they have the nexus to be able to draw that out. You know what's happened up in the Great Lakes, between the Great Lakes states, the provinces of Canada, and then no export of water out of the Great Lakes areas. We're seeing Nevada and Utah in a squabble. But the one that may turn out to be the most fascinating one is the one that's going on to the Supreme Court, I think, this week for oral arguments between Texas and Oklahoma over the allocation of the water out of the Red River. So those decisions will have huge impacts upon how the courts interpret those interstate compacts and doctrines probably over the next couple of decades.
I have a question if nobody else does. And I want to say that being the speaker after lunch is partly so that we can have more people attend, because in the past we've had these keynote speakers and unfortunately they get stuck in the morning. So I really appreciate your coming down to talk to us. One of the things I was going to ask James Pritchett, he had to take off, but I believe that your background would be helpful, maybe just part of this discussion is, because I'm an engineer, I constantly think of how to break things down into pieces that I can measure. And on this subject of ag water value, we talked a lot about, at least in James's session, and we sort of concluded with this issue of how we go about valuing it. How do you find a baseline? And it occurs to me that one of the stumbling blocks in this discussion, and Gary's mentioned this too, is not just what is the baseline as a question, but how do you actually go about finding, how do you decide on a method, or how do you take that approach towards finding a baseline for something that is so variable? I mean, and I guess I'm just thinking of, as an engineer, I go through a certain set of processes, I look up codes, and there's a fairly linear approach to an endpoint. But can we talk a little bit about this in the time that we have here, about how as an economist you would approach that question? Not so much what's the answer, but what are the steps you go through? And I'm just sort of thinking of whatever you come off the top of your head with that.
I understand there's going to be a really good symposium on that this fall, Harry, that all these people should attend. It's a really good question because I think we need new models. I don't think that the models that we have relied upon have been comprehensive enough to really capture all the things that we need to evaluate, and more particularly over time. I was interested in Todd's presentation when he was talking about the pilot programs, and I know Jay Winter's involved in some pilot programs, and the time periods in those pilots are like 10-year time periods. And people think about, oh wow, that's a long time, but not really. When you think about weather changes, when you think about the kinds of interruptions that we've had, 10 years isn't very long at all in that context. It may seem long in terms of human life, but for geologic time and for climate changes and things, it's not so very long at all. So time becomes important. The second thing, Perry, I think is important is not to isolate the model to a few things simply because we can quantify them. Some of the things that are going to be important, which may be evaluations of technology that may occur, have to be factored in. And when we talk about water conservation, technology becomes really important. But you've got to think of technology in much broader ways. If you modify the genetic structure of plants that require irrigation to be more drought tolerant, that's technology. And that has an effect. And it will have an effect on the economic production within that geographic region as well. I think we're going to get to a situation, there's a lot of discussion that goes on about the reuse of water and how we factor reuse in. Todd talked a lot about Swazi 2010 going into 2016. Reuse of water is a keystone part of the foundation of that. But if you look at reuse, reuse can't be a tactic in every single instance, because under Colorado water law, it has to first of all be a water right that allows that reuse. So not every municipality has a water right that will allow reuse of the water going through. And we shouldn't gloss over those things. So you had said, I think earlier, the complexity and the uniqueness of each circumstance becomes very hard to generalize from. But I think we can still do that. It's just that we haven't figured out what it is that we need to not include as opposed to what we do include.
And I suppose that was a good answer, because I think that is the purpose of the symposium, is to highlight some of the models that are either in development or that we're unaware of that you can package into an approach to that question. So I appreciate Dick as kind of my co-pilot for this symposium. What about others? Are we good on questions here? I mean, I know people are digesting information and food at the same time, so it's a little tough sometimes. But I would really like to give Dick a round of applause.